Howdy, welcome to Artist and Critic. We're back again, yes we are, to make your day happy or your evening happy whenever you're saying this. We're going to be having a two-part series on Paul Suzanne, and as you're well aware, I'm sure, there is an exhibition of late Cezanne's at the Museum of Modern Art dealing with the last 10 years or so, and we're going to try to discuss some of the emotional qualities that are in Cezanne. Now, everyone talks about him in terms of his structural aspects, in terms of the way he uses color to model form, and this, of course, led to Cubism in the 20th century and still is alive in our own time. I think these aspects of his work have been emphasized to the exclusion of some of the stronger emotional elements and the symbolic elements in his work. And I think it's the emotional elements, the symbolic elements that give his work the lasting power and the expression that they have. I think if he was simply a structural artist alone, that implies a certain degree of intellectuality, use of the intellect, and rather than the emotions. And I think possibly we might not think of him as sympathetically and feel as strongly about Cezanne if he were of an intellectual sort. Just a brief setting of some background. We must realize that Cezanne, of course, is world-renowned, and his pictures are prized and go for fabulous sums of money, and they're in private collections and museums all over the country, all over the world. But during his lifetime, he was laughed at, he was scorned, he was ignored, he was left in isolation in the south of France, in Aix-en-Provence. And luckily for Cezanne, he was left a small amount of money that he could live on. He wasn't forced to make a living from his art or from any other kind of work. But there's something always ironic when institutions put on shows after the artist is dead, after the artist has been ignored for all this time. And this is not to criticize the Museum of Modern Art. It's an institution like all institutions, and I do want to gratefully acknowledge the fact that the Museum of Modern Art has loaned us photographs of some of Cezanne's works, and so that they will take up a major part of the program. But there is this certain sense of irony, particularly when you go to the entrance of the exhibition and you see some of the new additions to the museum collection, and you see this really abominable paucity of talent and a lack of profundity, completely superficial works, and there's a certain structural minimal quality to them that, of course, makes them the direct descendant of Cezanne, but how paltry and how insignificant are these works alongside of the great works of Paul Suzanne. And one wonders what would happen if Paul Suzanne were alive today and he walked into a gallery on Madison Avenue, or even had the audacity to go to the Museum of Modern Art and show his pictures in the current atmosphere of superficiality and artificiality. I have a strong suspicion, because I know artists of substance who are ignored, that Cezanne would be ignored today. And it's ironic that, in a sense, that he has this show in any museum, and it happens to be the Museum of Modern Art. In a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about why is there so little significant art in our time, but maybe we'll make a few points today during Cezanne. Okay, we'll go to the first picture. And we see a close-up here of hands of the painter Achille Empereur, very early Cezanne painting of another artist, painted in the late 1860s, when Cezanne's approximately 30 years old. And it's often been said that Cezanne does not show human qualities in his figures. He's completely concerned with structure. He's completely concerned with form and intellectual aspects. But I would suggest that in this early painting, there's a strong suggestion of emotionality, of personality, as in many of Cezanne's early works where emotion is just rife in the pictures. He's a complete emotional dynamo. And this work may be awkward, according to, certainly was awkward according to fashionable painting of the time, but there's a power about it, there's a sense of form and strength in it that gives a clue to Cezanne's future greatness as a painter. It may be crude, but boy, is it a living artistic expression. The long bony hands hanging down and the rather stick-like legs, but very powerfully painted. And this is the work of a powerful creator. Okay, let's go to the next painting. We see a portrait of a woman called Seated Woman in Blue. This picture we're going to see is in the Museum of Modern Art show on Cezanne. All these pictures are from Cezanne's last 10 years. He dies about the age of 66 in 1906. And look at the woman. Isn't there a feeling of ennui, of frustration, perhaps of boredom, of certain suffering quality? There is a feeling, however you interpret it, there definitely is a feeling of personality in this late figure painting by Cezanne. The forms are solid in the new CEZANNE'S way of modeling the forms. It's a picture that reeks of emotionalism and of mood. We'll discuss as we go along that these last 10 years of Cezanne's work, he reaches a point of apathesis, in a sense, of a fullness of final fullness of emotional expression. The emotional expression returns in force in these late pictures as they were in the early pictures. In his middle period, he's searching for a certain classical balance that will order his landscapes and figures and so forth, and there will be a formal sense of balance. But in these late pictures, they become tumultuous, final emotional expressions before life leaves Cezanne. It's this final burst, expanding of the flame before his death, in a sense. Okay, we'll go to the next one. And we take a look at an early Cezanne, one of his early masterpieces, entitled The Black Marble Clock, painted about 1870 or so, give or take a year or two. And at this time when he is struggling to find himself, he is in emotional turmoil, personal emotional turmoil, and it's reflected in his paintings. Becomes this sense of monumental classical order and simplicity of form, fullness and substance of form in this picture. The clock itself, the folds of the cloth, the three hanging rectangles of the cloth in the foreground, the cup just to the right of the shell, and then the large shell on the left of the picture. Now, it's extremely solid, it's extremely ordered, and this is almost a leap forward. This will be some of the sense of dynamic balance and stable order that Cezanne will become known for in his later painting development. But one thing I want to talk about very briefly before we go to the next one is this sense of darkness in the picture. It's a very heavy, dark picture, as many of his early ones were. Also notice the shell. There's a certain feeling of, it becomes almost like a mouth in a sense. And keep in mind that opening of the shell, because we're going to be talking about it, and it becomes kind of symbolic of Cezanne's own inner torment, his demon, if you will. And I believe it's a fantastically expressive shell in itself, but the opening suggests almost a gaping mouth, open in pain or doubt or agony. Okay, let's go to the next picture. And the next picture will be a late Cezanne still life at the Museum of Modern Art, still life with apples and oranges. And as we pull back on it and pull back on it and slowly pull back on it, we'll get a sense of the picture in its entirety. And these late period still lives have a tremendous emotional impact. They are dynamic. In his middle period, there's a sense of the horizontal in his work that gives them great stability and great immobility. In his late pictures, angles begin to tip. They become angles. Edges begin to tip and tilt and so forth. We'll see his paintings of a rock quarry later on in this program or next, where the earth seems actually to be quaking under some cataclysmic force. I would suggest that aside from the sense of form and structure, that we're looking almost at a battle between the forces of light and darkness. And the fruit and the compote at the top, the cloth through the lower center of the picture. Cezanne, when he paints particularly the dark background around some of these light forms, he's obviously interested in the design shapes of flower patterns and folds and so forth, but these dark pattern cloths and that he selects to lay on his tables with his fruit on top are molded into almost symbols of his own inner emotional expression. The looping angle of them, some of the darkness of them. For example, I draw your attention to almost a mouth-like shape in the lower left-hand corner of the picture. Maybe we can focus in on it. Between there's almost a dark rectangle at the lower left of the picture, and emerging from underneath the white at the top, we see this round, almost mouth-like shape. And if we can see it fairly clearly, it's almost has this sense of suffering expression, as if there's a yell coming forth from that shape that is sublimated but still there, sublimated in the darkness underneath the white cloth, but still there and expressing something of suffering and some, or if you don't think of it as suffering, something of the emotional quality in Cezanne. Okay, let's, we'll go to the next picture. And sort of to underscore the point that we're making, we're going to take a look at a painting by Arshile Gorky, painted in 1944, and simply to draw your attention to those oval-shaped, mouth-like forms. They could almost be vaginal, symbolic shape forms. But there's when you see that kind of a shape in a painting, you'll see it in some surrealist paintings. I picked Gorky because he dies of cancer. This is painted in 44. I think he dies of cancer in the late 40s or around 50. And I particularly remember a painting by him called Agony, which he paints in the throes of his death from cancer. And it is filled with those mouth-like, gaping, kind of pinched oval forms that you see scattered all over the picture, you know, particularly in the lower left-hand corner, probably is some of the dominant forms. But these forms express suffering, and or let's put it this way, the state of, they depict an emotional state. They depict the emotional state of the artist, and it's not happy emotion. It is a more profound emotion, and I kind of see it as suffering, as extreme emotionalism. Okay, why don't we go to the next one? And we will see another late Cezanne still life, this one also from the Museum of Modern Art, called Apples and Oranges, and I believe this is in the museum's permanent collection. It's a wonderful, marvelous painting in terms of form, in terms of luscious color, the color of the oranges, the multicolor of the drape and the jug that he painted so often in the background, and the sugar bowl behind the fruit. These objects become symbolic of Cezanne himself. You know, artists really paint themselves. And we'll see it, whatever an artist paints, they select still life objects, they arrange them so that they reflect their own inner needs as a person. They paint people that appeal to them. They select portions of landscape that move them in some way. And you'll recall Cezanne saying, you know, about his art career that he searches for the right motif when he's out looking for a landscape. and he waits till it rings a bell with him, till it coincides with his own inner feelings and his own inner needs, so that when he paints his rocks and trees, when he paints his apples and sugar bowls, he's really painting himself. They reach a point of identification with himself. Okay, now, if we expand to see the whole picture and then close in on the lower right foreground, see, we're seeing an island of white surrounded by this chaotic, beautiful formal structure of the cloth, the darkness. There's a certain threatening quality. And if we go in right to the lower right-hand corner of the picture, you're looking at the left-hand corner of the picture.
I'm sorry.
We want to go to the right-hand side. We see a gaping, round, mouth-like form with almost like a tongue in it. It's right at the bottom of the screen. It's about to leave the screen. Why don't we tip down just a little more if we can focus in on it? We see that same kind of form expressive of sort of a subliminal emotional struggle in the artist. Okay, we'll go to the next picture. If anyone has any doubts that Cezanne is painting things of symbolic significance, of emotional significance, the next painting, also at the Museum of Modern Art, will perhaps dispel any doubts. When he paints these 4 human skulls, entitled, I guess, Pyramid of Skulls, and they form roughly a rectangle or a triangle, depending on how you look at it. In one sense, he's treating them almost like the apples and oranges for their pure formal qualities, their solidity, and the fact that their solidity enhances their reality and expresses some of the reality of life and the depth of Cezanne's reaction to the reality of life. We have to realize he always painted from nature, with the exception of perhaps some of his late fantasy bather scenes. And whereas most people today don't consider nature as their source, Cezanne was wise enough to realize that he had to find his inspiration there, or the work becomes sterile and empty. But the emotional quality of this piece is obvious. You know, he's staring death right in the face, you know, in a sense. And the mood of these skulls, they are not objectively observed skulls. They are very subjectively seen. The sockets of the eyes are staring, much like those mouth-like forms we've been talking about in some of the pictures, and express this strong emotional quality in these pictures. Cezanne is more than just the progenitor of Cubism. We might say that the Picasso and Braque and all of the hundreds of other painters early in the 19th century, we can go to the next picture, early in the 19th century who were influenced by Cezanne, took simply one facet of his work. They took the angularity, they took the sense of formal structure that's in his work, and it gives his pictures great design strength, but without the emotional quality underneath, I think they would be not nearly as powerful and moving as they are. Okay, let's take a look at that next picture. This is a late watercolor by Cezanne, another skull emerging almost from on that same cloth that he painted so many times, almost like a stone from the sea in a sense. It becomes a haunting, hypnotic, visionary picture. As you know, it's solid form and the beautiful angularity and folds of the cloth, but this is a haunting emotional study. Okay, we'll go to the next one. We'll take a look at a self-portrait by Cezanne, I believe painted in the late 1870s, when he's just beginning to move into a new sense of himself, a new understanding of his painting and himself, and with the help of Pizarro, with whom he painted for several years off and on, we see a sense of a sureness, the raising of the eyebrow on the left, his right eyebrow, and a certain almost smiling quality, as if, yes, I'm finally getting it all together. And this massive head painted only as Cezanne can paint a head, with the side plane of the nose beautifully coming out of the darkness of the cheek and the front plane darkened, and it becomes a magnificent structure. Okay, let's go to the next one, and we'll take a look at Cezanne in the mid-1880s, when he finds in his landscapes and his still lives, not totally exclusively, a balance, a solid stability, and a sense of fulfillment and order. Now, this picture, when I first look at it, put me off. You know, it seems sort of cold and impersonal and brutally simple. And then I looked at it more closely, you know, and some of the, you know, there are obvious design devices with the rectangular palette at the bottom fitting the rectangular structure of the corner of the canvas. You know, we're missing the corner of the canvas to see how it echoes the corner. But really more important than some of these formal aspects is the look in Cezanne's face. And amazingly, at this time of artistic fulfillment and balance, there is almost a glazed look in his eye, as if he's so deeply into himself, so deeply into his painting, that he has assumed almost a mystical glazed state, you know, as if he is probing so deeply that even though his works are very realistic and he's painting from nature, it's almost as if he has assumed some sort of mystical union with himself and with nature. A very, very arresting picture. These last two self-portraits are not at the Met, nor is this next picture. Let's take a look at the next one. Painting of Madame Suzanne, painted in the, got a little bit of a shadow on the picture. If it doesn't, well, we'll have to adjust it in the next picture. Maybe pull the camera back a little bit because there's this camera shadow on the picture. But let's don't do it now. We'll talk about the picture and we'll take care of it for the next. In the mid-1880s, this is Madame Suzanne, who patiently endured Cezanne's probing gaze and study. There's a certain order, a certain stability, despite the angle of the chair, that is brought together by the different altitudes of the black molding at the back of the picture. It's these pictures like these that has given Cezanne the reputation of not painting personalities, not being sensitive to personalities, not being interested in personalities. Of course he's interested in personalities, and Madame Suzanne is a living entity, a living individual without any exaggerated personal qualities, and he does stress in this mid-period, in the 1880s, early 1890s, a search for this almost brittle, metallic sense of simple, solid structure, as if the head and were carved out of wood or stone, and the garments were cast out of plaster or some solid structural substance. But look what happens in the last 10 years of his life, and we'll go to the next picture, and we'll see a portrait of Vallier, Cezanne's gardener. There are three pictures, three late portraits of Vallier, three oils in the Cezanne exhibit at the Modern, and they're like thunderclouds. They're dark and brooding and heavy, and rather large pictures, I'm guessing at the size, maybe 30 by 36, which is fairly large for Cezanne. It's a postage stamp in our own gaudily overstated age when we artists have nothing to say, so we make up with it with size, you know, and try to impress everybody with footwork, you know, that kind of thing. But Cezanne doesn't need size to make a statement. His little 10 by 12 pictures have the power of boulders. And in this portrait of Vallier, look at the face. Look at the sense of depth and dark power in this picture. Whether we sense what Vallier is like as an individual, it becomes a universal human brooding statement, perhaps in a way close to Rembrandt, although Rembrandt is very careful about human particularity and particular human qualities. This one has a dark, heavy, there are blue blacks and green blacks, and a marvelously powerful picture, and perhaps we can pull back and on it and see some of the whole picture without getting too much white. If we get too much white, then we can, that'll be fine. As we come to the close of this first segment on Cezanne, there's something very moving about the emotional quality in the exhibition, in the artist himself, and I have thought that if there is the right young man and the right young woman artist who sees this show, the effect on the future of art may be as profound, will be more profound than what happened in the early part of the century with the Cezanne's effect on the young Cubists. And because the new young artists will realize that Cezanne is rooted in reality and an emotional response to reality. And we need it, Cezanne did it, and there are people out there who I think will see it. Take care. We'll see you for part 2 next week.